Dr. Otley had mentioned that we are joined today at this meeting by our newest staff member, Mike Flynn, who joined in October, moved here from Utah, brought his family here to take advantage of this extraordinary opportunity that he sees here in Rochester. Comes to us from an organization somewhat like you mentioned, Greater MSP earlier in your comments, Mr. Chair, an organization somewhat like Greater MSP, but for the state of Utah. Prior to that, a regional organization in Charlotte, North Carolina, and comes to us with a great deal of experience around this body of work that we need help with, which is around business development, business recruitment. And so with that, Mike, I'll give you the floor. And
excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation today to come and talk a little bit about what we're going to be working on from an economic development perspective. Slides we've put together, there's an element of them that are sort of informational or laying the groundwork. Happy to dive deep into any of it and answer more questions as we get into this. So one of the first questions I often get asked is when we talk about site selection, lead generation, what are we talking about specifically? And so we put together this definition that sort of drills down on what we do on a day-to-day basis. So these are typically opportunities we're working on that are multi-market evaluations of a different host of variables that companies are trying to analyze to make an investment decision. And some of the important parts of this, the first one is the multi-market component of it. These are companies that are not just making a real estate transaction, but they're trying to analyze a market to figure out where they're going to get the highest and best return on an investment. And our job in the economic development department is to really have the data and information and educate those companies on how this market competes for their project. So there's a lot that goes into doing that well. The second question I've gotten asked as I've talked to people, whether it's neighbors or people in the business community of why I'm here and what I'm doing, is why are we doing this now? Why did DMC decide to launch this?
Could we go back to
Sure.
your slide, please? What's the most difficult question you run into to try and overcome? All the high
Sure.
You
know, it's changed over, I've done this for about 20 years. I would say in the last few years, the hardest question is, where are my people going to come from? You know, there's a platitude that the three most important questions in a site selection project, or the three most important variables, are people, people, and people. Companies solving for real estate, solving for incentives, solving for utilities. In the last 5 years, those variables sort of have dropped on the list of priority, and accessing workforce is by far the biggest decision driver that I faced in Utah and that I faced in North Carolina.
How do you answer that?
Well, it's typically we'll do a labor analysis and figure out what sort of talent exists in the market, who can they hire away from other businesses, what sort of talent is coming into the market, so who's graduating universities, what sort of workforce development initiatives exist to help upskill labor in a given market. There's not a silver bullet. It's generally working with them across a number of different strategies to find the right people for those positions. You know, there's an aspect of this. Sometimes it's helping them understand that this might not be the best market for them. You know, we've had in my career companies come in that were trying to accomplish a very specific thing from a workforce standpoint, and we did not have a good answer for them, whether it was in Utah or it was in North Carolina. And part of the job is helping them. You don't ever want a company to make a bad decision. You don't want them to make a decision to come into your market if you don't think you're going to be successful. And so part of the objective is educating them on what we can do in a given market, what opportunities exist, what challenges are going to exist, so that they can make an informed decision. And sometimes that informed decision is around challenges that might exist for hiring. So understand your resource, understand your capacity from a workforce standpoint, and make sure the company understands sort of the pros and cons of that.
Thank you.
Great question.
So back to the question of why are we doing this now? And as I thought about this, there are really 4 or 5 reasons that jumped out. The first, and it was a pretty sort of profound realization for me, was the investment that's been made here in all of the infrastructure, both physical and maybe a little more figurative infrastructure, has really got this market from the standpoint of a product, I think, ready to go out and be received by the broader marketplace. one of the hallmarks of my career is I've tended to work in a lot of high growth places where the infrastructure investment has trailed the economic development. And I have a lot of familiarity in working in communities where we're always sort of being squeezed for whether it's transit capacity or water, sewer, power capacity. All those variables are always in sort of a scarcity mentality. And I think one of the things that's intriguing about this opportunity for me personally is that paradigm seems to have been shifted a little bit, in that it's been very thoughtful to sort of build this infrastructure and build the product, you could say. And now the economic development function is coming on the back end of that. So it's in the first week I was here, it was the thing that sort of jumped out to me as the most different about this opportunity with others I've had in my career. I think the second thing is, as far as why now, is really related to Discovery Square. And there's sort of two aspects of that. There are two almost universal conversations you have with a company when they're looking to make an investment decision. And the first one is who's there, who's come recently, who do I know that's in this market, who made the decision to invest in this market, and help me understand that story. Discovery Square One really affords us the ability to have a lot of those examples of companies that have come in and proven this market. Once you have that conversation, the second conversation is, okay, where do I go? Where does my business go? And so having existing products sitting there that is world-class space next to a building that's full of world-class companies really affords us the ability to not only tell the story of who's here, but to then provide a really turnkey solution to where that company could land. So the existence of those buildings is significant. I think the third variable is sort of all of the real estate and infrastructure that exists outside of Discovery Square. So I think that second building provides a company the ability to sort of see their future and how they could fit in this market. That building's not going to be a fit for everybody. And so the fact that we've got additional turnkey real estate, greenfield sites, brownfield sites in close proximity allows us to present a company with a second, third, or fourth option, which again, think back to the fact that this is multi-market. They are competing this market with somewhere else, and we want to make sure we've got as good an answer as the other markets they're looking at. And I think the fourth reason, and this is sort of universal, is the economy is really sort of restructuring right now in terms of where people are working, how they're working. I think it's going to continue pretty dramatically over 2022 as businesses come back online and start to put people back in offices. And so I think sort of the global economy is ripe for us to put this market out in front of companies looking to make an investment decision and really have them evaluate us alongside maybe some more traditional markets they've looked at in the past. Another question is sort of how does this process work? And so I made an attempt here to sort of put together sort of our workflow. On the left, there's a tremendous amount of awareness building we have to do around this community and the DMC concept and what we have to offer here. In my first month of starting to go out and talk to the market about what exists here, I'd say that the universal is there's just not a lot of familiarity with what we have to offer. So I think there's going to be a lot of awareness building on the left. When we do that well, companies will start to call us with project opportunities, allow us to compete on those. We'll put those into a project management process, engage in some back and forth with research and site visits. Definitely there'll be conversations around incentives and what can the state and locals do. And then if we do that whole process well, these things typically resolve either with a win, which is a company making a decision to invest here, a loss, a company making a decision to invest in another market they considered, or a drop, which is where the evaluation sort of gets them to the point where they make no decision, or they decide not to make a decision. They decide not to go anywhere. So,
could I bring the mayor in for a second?
Yes.
Yeah, Mike, can you address one of the issues that we could have, and maybe you have a perfect answer for this, but one of the things that I've heard before when we've talked about bringing in a certain retail store or restaurant is your market's too small. You only have 122,000 people that live in Rochester. And I'm hoping you'll be able to share our story well enough. And maybe you can tell me how you plan on doing this. I assume you've thought about this. We talked about it, a month or two ago when you were here. How do we sell Rochester as, even though we're a smaller but growing town, that we're the place to be, and that we have the workforce? I know we have the academic numbers to show. We have a very talented and very smart and highly educated community. Better, higher, better is maybe not the right word, but we can compete with many communities and win out on that that part. We have the skill set, but do we have the numbers? Are we a large enough market for businesses, whether they be the type that maybe, biomedical and retail? Do we have that right market, and how will you sell us?
So I think I would answer that two ways. One is we have to define what that market is. The county has a certain population, the city has a certain population, the 4-county MSA has another population. The state defines us as part of this southeast region that is yet another population. I would argue our proximity to the Twin Cities is close enough that we can consider part of that community our population. And so part of it is understanding what that trade area is. Is it 100? Is it 200? Is it 400? The second thing is, as we compete, as we proactively go out and look for projects, is making sure we size those deals appropriately. We're probably not going to go pitch a 4,000 person project. It's not going to make sense for them. It's not going to make sense for us. So part of it is sizing our business development, our outreach effort. I would say there's a rule of thumb that you typically want 1,000 employees for 1,000 population for every one employee a company's going to hire. And some people ratchet that down to 500, but there's generally a given market can compete effectively on a certain size project. One of the things that I have to learn, I think we have to figure out here, is what does Mayo do to skew that number? I have not worked anywhere like this where you've got an institution like that sort of in your backyard. My guess is for certain projects, it will help us compete on larger deals, bigger opportunities. How that impacts against retail, I think there's some homework we have to do, and we have to sort of learn some of those answers. But I would say there's two things. One is how do we define our labor shed, and two is let's make sure we're competing on the right size projects.
And I appreciate that, and I appreciate the answer, and thank you for that. You've obviously put some thought into this. And I would say the other piece is we do have the 3.2 million visitors that are a unique type of visitor, some of which stay here a long time, and to link that into your pitch.
Absolutely.
And then the other thing I want to say is this is my personal pitch for high-speed rail between the Twin Cities and Rochester, so that Twin Cities market is indeed easier to sell people, that we do have access, not that we want to steal them, but we want to share the opportunity with them.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I would just agree with that. And I know, for example, talking with the folks at Greater MSP, they want to include Rochester in the larger region, and the ability to pitch the educational institutions, the university, major land grant university, and I know they've got a campus down here. And I think those are all part of maximizing, the pitch to folks in terms of a particularly workforce, being able to draw folks from the Twin Cities and workers from the Twin Cities and all of those small colleges in the region. I think that's all part of the pitch. So I assume that really this is kind of a version of Greater MSP being built kind of within the DMC. And I'm assuming that we are kind of collaborating with them, and again with DEED at the state level, where they also are trying to pitch the state as a whole. And I know the state obviously hugely values the DMC effort. So
yeah, I don't see the competition for us being inside the state of Minnesota. It's the Austins and it's places outside of this market that are going to be the other ones on the list. I think we're selling the state. Again, I think we're selling, I don't know if it's 10 counties or 15 counties, but my plan as we go out and talk to companies is to talk about sort of the state as the product we're selling. The site might be in Rochester, it might be in sort of the DMC footprint, but the product we're selling is really the state.
Sometime if you find yourself in San Francisco, hop in a car at rush hour and drive to Silicon Valley. Now compare the drive to here, okay? Yeah, exactly. So if Silicon Valley can attract workers because they can go to San Francisco, we can absolutely attract Rochester because Minneapolis is more fun than San Francisco, but that's a personal opinion. I do think one of the things that we are not doing is the idea that sometimes the way to expose many, many people at once in these fields is through the convention business. Having worked a lot on conventions in Minneapolis, St. Paul, we would, when we talk to medical conventions, talk about the proximity to Mayo Clinic. I think one of the things we're missing is to having the two convention operations talking about hybrid conventions, where actually they're being attracted to the very, very large facilities in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and coming down here for part of the time too, selling that idea of a medical ecosystem. We can do that one-on-one.
You're making my case for high-speed rail. I just want to.
That is
Thank you.
no, I mean it definitely is a part of it, but we don't have to wait. We should be, and this is something that I brought to the greater MSP points, and also raised with the Convention and Visitors Association. I know that's scary sometimes for Rochester, thinking we want the whole convention, just as it's scary for Minneapolis, St. Paul to say we want the whole convention. The fact of the matter is, if somebody is going to have the major bio conference in Boston or San Francisco, there is a facility that can serve that in downtown Minneapolis, but we can bring those folks down here. So I think we ought to wrap that convention and visitor experience in, because it's very much a part of putting places on the map too.
Absolutely.
Got a question?
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Member Campbell.
Well, Mike, welcome. It's great to have you on board. I look forward to meeting you. I just want to underscore and reinforce the importance of the investment in the lead generation. I mean, we've got a sales job ahead of us, and Mike's now on board. Mike, it was really good to hear you say that you were surprised that we had already done a lot of the hard work in the infrastructure, and that was unique to your previous experiences. And that's true. I mean, we do have a lot of that behind us. But what I'd really like to have you do for our next meeting is I'd really like to hear what you think the target market is. I'd like to hear your sales pitch, which would include the competitive advantages of why Rochester.
Absolutely, and that's something we're working on. We've got the framework of a program for next year built, focusing in markets that are high growth, primarily life sciences, healthcare markets, starting to frame out sort of what I would call our 10-slide elevator pitch. What are the most important things for a company to know about this market? Again, so hopefully we can start to get on the list of some of these expansion opportunities. Where are deals going to come from? I would mention this is sort of historically in my career where deals have come from. I don't think this will be the breakdown of where we see deals in this market. Company direct, that usually is the result of a lot of awareness building. So companies start to understand your market or start to understand the economic development function. They will proactively call you. I think that's a thing that's going to take a few years for us to build here, sort of that reactive pipeline. Location advisors, these are people in the country that help companies move around. Again, that was about a quarter to a third of our deals in Utah, North Carolina. As I've started to talk to some of these professionals, they're not really aware of this function, so I think it's going to take some time to build that. In-market connectors, I think that's going to be outsized here with the resource that Mayo is in terms of feeding us opportunities and deal flow. Proactive outreach, that's sort of the idea. We start to screen companies, and I think the goal is let's go talk to 1,000 companies a year or 2,000 companies a year and plant the seed of what the opportunity is here in Rochester. So I think one of the things we'll report on going forward is as we run this program, where are we seeing deals come from, and how do we adjust going forward to make sure that we're spending our money in places that really generate opportunities. Industry focus, I think there's sort of some immediate opportunities, obvious, healthcare, life sciences, med tech. As the concept of America City for Health has been explained to me, it really sort of opened my eyes to, I think, a whole different strategy and a different approach to businesses and other industries that really put a value on health and wellness and safety. I think about some of the projects I worked on in other markets, food and beverage, companies that were trying to target or had a value proposition that was built around health. Did a lot of outdoor product stuff in Utah, and there's a lot of companies out there that their value proposition is built around health and safety. I could see a universe where we compete very effectively here, given that this is America City for Health, given the resource we've got in our backyard. So, immediately I think we'll focus on some of these low-hanging fruit areas, but long-term, I could see a strategy that really wraps around a lot of different industries in interesting ways. Metrics, some of the other things we'll talk about. One is obviously contacts. How many companies, consultants, connectors, how many people are we out in front of? the first couple of years, we're going to have to do a lot of this. Just tell them what the organization is, what the footprint is, what the mission is, how we're structured, what the partnerships are. We really just have to pound this message of what the DMC is in a lot of different avenues. We do that well, we'll start to have some of these new project start metrics. How many companies are coming to us with opportunities? Where are we sourcing those deals from? What are the decision drivers? Is it a real estate play? Is it a workforce play? And what does that pipeline look like? We'll report a lot of activity-based metrics. So how many sites are we submitting? How many RFIs are coming in? Site visits, incentive applications. And then ultimately the goal of this whole thing is how many announces are we having? So, and what are the jobs, investment, real estate, tax revenue? What are all the things, that net incremental activity? What does that look like? So we'll build the dashboard once we start to generate some activity that really hits on these different items. Some action items. So you mentioned the business case. That's the thing that we're trying to craft right now, really wrap our head around the unique value proposition here. And that's a function of a lot of different things. Take that business case, turn it into some collateral, again, information that's easily digestible. If we get 20 minutes with a company, what do we want them to understand? What are sort of the 3 or 4 most important variables? We need to start to build this client database of different key customers out in the market, whether that's a consultant, a connector, a company executive, a corporate real estate executive, wherever the decision makers are in these different audiences. We want to make sure that we know who they are. We've got to build some CRM infrastructure to manage all of this. It's one thing when we've got 1 or 2 projects, but I look forward to a couple of years when we've got 100. It's a lot of data to keep track of, and how are we marketing to these companies that maybe have a 2-year sales cycle? It's not uncommon for us to sit down with a business and have them be really intrigued and then have them say, my lease in this facility is up in a year, come back and talk to me in a year. And so we want to make sure to manage all that data so that we can run an efficient program and make sure we're back in front of people at the right times. Again, I mentioned the awareness and outreach. There's going to be a lot of that in the short term of just getting the word out. And again, we do all that well, and we'll start to initiate projects, and we can come to these meetings and have a whole host of opportunities that we're competing on. So next 90 days, define the value proposition, document the business case, begin designing some of this high-level collateral. Again, you're never going to win a project. You're never going to, solve a deal with your collateral, with your business case. But what we want to do is open the door to as many places as we can. So build out. We want to begin outreach. We've already started some of that. I've probably had a dozen conversations with people I've worked with in the past, primarily on the consulting side, but we want to move that into targeted recruiting, looking in January to start getting out on the road and really sharing the message. We need to inventory the product. So again, Discovery Square 1 and 2 are obvious, but what other opportunities exist sort of in the immediate market? And then 4 sort of got dumped there, but you can see we want to create a program of work for 2022 that talks about where we're going to be. Are these initiatives focused on lead generation? Are they focused on building awareness? What activities take place in the market? What activities take place out of the market? And sort of how do we put together a well-rounded program that has longevity and sustainability and really sort of produces the results that we're interested in?
Coincidentally, 90 days is happens to be the date of our next board meeting as well.
Good, thank you.
And then I think there was a question around, sort of who's part of this effort. Just sitting down in my first sort of 30 days, it's a big group. It's people inside the market, inside the city, inside the county, inside the state. I think these are all people that we're going to want to partner with. I'll apologize in advance. I'm sure I missed somebody, and I'm sure we'll hear from them. But it's a broad effort, and it's an effort that's going to include a lot of people on the public and private sides. You never know what question a company is going to have. And I've always said our job is not to know all the answers, but our job is to know the people that do. And that's part of the team we have to build here. So
Okay, good. Member Campbell, is your hand up?
Yeah, I just think this is really exciting. And when you have your package put together, Patrick, I think we should talk to Shreeza here at the Carlson School, and we should get you on the first Tuesday agenda to tell the story of the DMC, and particularly the game plan that you have to recruit businesses to Rochester.
Thank you. Appreciate that opportunity.
Any other finishing comments on just this area? I want to actually just make two quick ones. First off, pivoting on that earlier question about everywhere else you've worked, they've done the recruitment first and the infrastructure later. NBC News did a night in Austin, and they were blah, blah, blah going on about Austin and Austin. And I thought, have you ever driven in rush hour in Austin, which has one freeway serving the entire metropolitan area and zero transit? So some of this work, the brain damage we've done over 7 years on transit planning and all of that sort of thing is very much about that. The second point is one of the phenomenal things is to have a city of Rochester size competing with cities of much greater size and all that. And that's one of the amazing advantages here. And it's one thing to fight above your weight class. It's another thing to shift onto our own playing field. And what I mean by that is that in all of those much larger places that we compete with for some of these businesses, you mentioned, for instance, being in Boston, you cannot have the same quality of life as you have here. There is the ability to have a walkable neighborhood that you can walk to at lunch. There is the idea of getting on a bike after work and riding 100 miles of bike trails and winding up the Minnesota River, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I like the idea of America's City for Health, but honestly, I prefer something closer to heart of the heartland, which really plays to the fact that we have a very, very unique balance of life. And we do represent the core of the country. If you want to live in a San Francisco or Boston, you probably will. Many people come here in spite of. We need to get more people to move here because of. And I know many do, but we need to sell that about how tough it is to recruit out of here, et cetera, et cetera. So I've always seen it as heart of the heartland more than America's City for Health, because I think there's more, it gets us onto the playing field where we compete best.
My last comment, I'm a test case of one because over the last 6 months, when I made the decision that I wanted to leave Utah, I had a lot of opportunities in a lot of different parts of the country, and we looked at all of those and made this decision not only for the tremendous opportunity that this job affords me, but for the very reason you described. I know it's not a huge town, but I'm directionally challenged sometimes. The first day to drive to work, I plugged in my phone and I punched in the office address. And when it popped up that I had an 8-minute commute, I audibly laughed out loud and looked around for somebody to celebrate with. And I was me alone in the car. But
Yeah,
having all of those world-class amenities somewhere where you can have a beautiful home and an 8-minute commute is probably a big crux of our sales pitch to all these companies. So.
okay,
Appreciate
great.
it.
All right, thank you very much. As you can see, there's a tremendous amount of energy around this discussion. We're excited about it, and we're very excited about your position because it gets us where we need to be. Patrick, how are we doing here? We want to move on to retail recruitment, is this it?
Remarkably, we are spot on time-wise.
Not an accident.
Great challenge.
First time I've ever uttered those words.
Me too.